You can't even open up a news app or news website or turn on a TV show with the news on it without seeing some sort of headline referring to recession or stagflation. And clearly a lot of people are worried that this is the situation now. And I want to discuss how this is going to affect the housing market, because I saw an interesting article from Realtor.com talking about what they think is going to happen. So I want to go over it and kind of give my take on this. Now, first of all, many of us can agree that we've already been in a recession for a couple of years now. It's just becoming more and more obvious to more people now that things are getting worse. However, stagflation is something that doesn't happen very often. The last time we had stagflation in the United States was in the 1970s. And basically what happens then is when you have slow or no economic growth combined with high inflation and high unemployment. Well, we have high inflation, unemployment is not too high yet, and economic growth is projected to be going negative as of the first quarter of this year. So we almost have 2 out of 3. But they say one thing to distinguish and one main difference between stagflation and a recession is that a recession is a more normal part of the economic cycle, whereas stagflation is not. And I would even like to argue that we need recessions in order to cool things down. So everybody's looking at this as like a bad thing, that we could be heading into a recession or that we're already in a recession, whatever your point of view on it is. But in reality, it's a good thing because it is a form of an economic reset, which tends to bring prices down and creates new opportunities after the dust settles. But stagflation doesn't really have that effect, because when you have a high interest rate environment along with high unemployment, we can't really lower interest rates because inflation is too high. And then raising interest rates risk making unemployment even worse, crashing the economy even harder. Now, in a recession, consumer sentiment plummets, which is something that we saw happen recently, and people tend to delay major purchases like buying a house, for example. And we've already seen 30-year lows in home buyer demand as of recently, and a recession is just going to knock that demand down even further. A lot of people are projecting that 2025 is going to be roughly on par with 2024 in terms of home sales, but I wouldn't count on it, guys, because inventory's picking up, interest rates are not falling that much, they're still in the mid-6s right now, and there is so much uncertainty floating around, a lot of people are not going to be going out there and buying a house. And then, of course, as the inventory builds, it puts downward pressure on home prices. But without a healthy labor market, buyers can't keep up their part of the deal. They cannot keep up the demand for buying homes. And even if we did have a healthy labor market, even if buyer demand was strong, the recent uncertainty in the economy would certainly be knocking the wind out of their sails now. Now, here's one thing that I disagree with this story, because they talk about how we had stagflation back in the 1970s, but home prices did not decline during this time period, and mortgage rates actually peaked close to 19% back then. So they're looking at it and they're arguing like, yeah, if we could make it through that back then going through the situation we have now should be nothing. Except they're missing one crucial detail in this story, which is that in the 1970s, wage growth was outpacing inflation. So even though we had high inflation and even though there was high unemployment, you still had a lot of people who were working that were exceeding inflation. You know, the people that were working were doing just fine. Whereas today, that is not the case. Everybody who's working is struggling for the most part, you know, except for the top 10% of earners basically throughout this country, but everybody else is struggling right now. A lot of people are holding at least 2 jobs to make ends meet, or doing gig work on the side in order to make ends meet. So it's easy to say, yeah, home prices didn't go down because people who are still working could easily still afford life and still afford their house payment, whereas today that is no longer true. Now, the biggest risk that homeowners are facing today is the possibility of a job loss, and many people are experiencing this right now, and that could be part of the reason why we're seeing home inventory pick up so much. That combined with high unaffordability. This is the other thing that people didn't have in the 1970s, by the way. If you owned your home outright in the 1970s, nobody had a care in the world back then. Nobody was worried about still being able to afford their house, guys. Everybody who watches my channel knows that today it is a very different story. Everybody who owns a home right now is worried about the rising expenses, even if your home is completely paid off. So those are two giant departures from how things were in the 1970s compared to today. And don't forget, job losses don't just impact current homeowners that may need to be forced to sell their house or could even end up losing the house if they can't afford to make the payments, but it also affects would-be home buyers. When people lose jobs or they're afraid to lose their job, they're not going to be out there looking to buy either. So you just have this combination of things where more properties hit the market, at the same time less people out there looking to buy. We're going to have a really cool new park here in Miami Beach pretty soon. Hopefully I'll get to walk it one time for the videos before I leave for the summer to go to California. Looks like it's getting there. Now, even with all of the new inventory we've been seeing on the US housing market, there are still some sellers who are kind of on the fence about what to do right now. And there's a few questions running through their heads. Like, the first thing is it a good time to move right now? Because if you own a home, chances are you don't want to be paying more than you're already paying right now unless you're getting a tremendous raise or something like that. While I would say it's still not a bad time to sell because prices in general are still elevated, the extra inventory we have now compared to a couple years ago is going to hurt you. It's going to cause your home to stay on the market longer, and it's probably going to force you to sell it at a lower price than you would have a couple of years ago. And when you look at how much inflation has been a problem, you're selling for a lower price, and those dollars you're receiving for your home are worth less than they were 2 or 3 years ago. So really, the best time to sell was 2 or 3 years ago for most people. But if you've owned your home for quite some time and built up a decent amount of equity, chances are you're still going to come out ahead. But one of the big hesitations for sellers before was that, if I sell, where am I going to go? There's not that much inventory, right? Well, that's no longer a problem, and many people shouldn't have a problem finding a house that they like anymore, considering that inventory levels are pretty much at pre-pandemic levels of inventory now. In fact, inventory has increased 25% from just 1 year ago, and a lot of people in the real estate industry are predicting that it's still going to rise another 10 to 15% this year. And I agree, it could be even more than that, depending on how hard of economic times we start having, One example I'm going to show you later in this video is just how many homes have been hitting the market in the Washington, D.C. area where there's been so many layoffs recently. That's a great modern day example of a lot of inventory hitting the market due to the economy getting worse. And really, if you're a seller out there right now, the number one thing you have to be concerned about is, are there going to be any buyers showing up to buy my house? And one rule of thumb I can tell you as a real estate agent, all the years I was selling real estate, you can sell any house in any economy, but be prepared to sell that house for the correct price. Because if you're not willing to do that, then you're not going to sell the house. Or it's going to take far longer to sell the house than you anticipated, and it's going to be a grueling task rather than just something simple. Now, like I just mentioned, let's talk about the Washington, D.C. market a little bit, because this is a fascinating detail on how the layoffs are affecting the housing market in real life and what we can expect to see across the country if we really get into a much worse situation than we're in right now. Already, inventory in the DC area was rising about 30% from June to December of 2024, but it has been picking up recently. In fact, as of February this year, inventory is up 41%, and as of March, it's up 56% more homes for sale than it was just 1 year ago, guys. So the layoffs are ramping up in DC, and the homes are hitting the market like no tomorrow. And what this shows you is a perfect example of increased desire to sell combined with decreased demand to buy. Even the experts are starting to admit that the elevated listing activity is potentially the canary in the coal mine for Washington, D.C., which is signaling that the mass doji firings that are happening are taking a toll on the local market. Well, duh, of course they are. According to Bright MLS, which is a regional MLS in the Mid-Atlantic, they say there was 2,050 new listings that came on the market just last week in the Washington, D.C. region, which is up 20% from just a year ago the same week, guys. Realtor.com is estimating that the new listings actually went up 24% in a week. And they say one obvious sign that the area is being impacted by the layoffs is if we continue to see the inventory just jump over there. Well, I went on Reventure app and I took some screenshots for you guys of just a few random zip codes over there to show you just how much inventory is jumping. It is truly insane. Check this one out. Zip code 20002. The inventory levels are absolutely skyrocketing, guys. It is far beyond pre-pandemic levels. Pre-pandemic, you would have had about 121 homes on the market in this zip code. Fast forward to today, it's 312, more than double what it was pre-pandemic. Zip code 211, they got 222 homes on the market versus pre-pandemic, it would have been only 119. So double. Zip code 201, 180 homes on the market for sale. Pre-pandemic, it was only 95. Zip code 209, another zip code where inventories exploded. And these are just a few examples. You can go look up this data for yourself, but pretty much all over the DC metro area, inventory is skyrocketing right now. Now, the next thing is something that was brought to my attention by one of my viewers, which is something I've realized before, but I've never really talked about that much here on the channel, and that is how Zillow's estimates are juicing the market. And one of my viewers even sent over a specific example that I want to share with you guys here. So he sent over this property located in the Midwest, and he said the Zestimate was at $1.1 million before this house was listed for sale. Then they listed it for $1.3 million. Then the Zestimate jumped to $1.22 million, so over $1 million just overnight on the Zestimate. And then once the house actually sold for asking price of $1.3 million, the Zillow Zestimate adjusted the Zestimate to $1.3 million. So it's like in a matter of weeks, the house went from being worth $1.1 million to $1.22 million. And then of course now Zillow uses that house as a comp for the neighborhood, which artificially inflates the values of other homes in the vicinity, which just leads to a constant loop of inflated home values. And he says, listen, imagine how many home buyers were duped into feeling confident to make high offers because the Zestimate told them to do so. He says it's absolute insanity and mainstream media is not talking about it. Well, I got your back because I'm definitely going to discuss this right now. So this is obviously a game that Zillow has been playing for quite some time. This is nothing new. However, in light of how much home prices have risen, the problem has been exacerbated just like basically every other problem. And you know, real estate is a very tough thing to value because the only way to truly value real estate, you have two methods. You can use comparable sales, okay, which is any other house that's sold in the neighborhood and how similar is the house you're looking to buy compared to that house it's sold and how much did that house sell for. That can give you a reasonable idea of what you could expect to pay for that house. Simple enough, right? And then of course the other way is, regardless of what the comps are, if somebody purchases a house, you could say that the house is worth however much somebody bought it for, because somebody out there in the world thought that the house was worth that much money, even if you don't think that. But the problem with that second method is just because you think the house is worth that much doesn't mean anybody else is going to, right? It's just like anything else that you try to buy and flip for a profit, so to speak, and sell to somebody else. The only way you can flip any item for a profit is with the greater fool theory, thinking that there's somebody out there who's a greater fool than you who's going to pay even more than you did. And sometimes you are the greatest fool, especially if you pay an asinine price for a property that nobody else is willing to pay. But here's the problem with the Zillow's Zestimate, right? They try to use a combination of both of these factors in order to estimate a property's potential value. But one piece of the story and one piece of the puzzle that Zillow is missing is this. They look at that house that sold for $1.3 million and they say that the Zestimate is $1.3 million, and they use that to make the Zestimate on surrounding properties even higher. However, if other properties in the area didn't sell for nearly as much, let's say the other comparables in the neighborhood are only 900,000 or 1 million, right? Significantly lower. Let's just use 1 million as a easy round number. So $300,000 less than what that house ended up selling for. Zillow can say whatever they want. They can make the Zestimate of the surrounding properties higher because of that one higher sale, but most people don't pay cash for homes and therefore are going to need an appraisal. And when your house goes to appraise, regardless of what the Zillow's estimate says, the appraiser is going to look at the real comps in the neighborhood. And if they're justified and they can essentially prove that that house is in fact worth 1.3 million under current market conditions, then buyers will be fine. The problem, of course, comes when they cannot prove that and it's only that one outlier sale that makes it look like values are rising in the neighborhood when really you just had one idiot overpay for a house. So yes, Zillow is definitely guilty of pumping up home values and making valuations look higher than they are. And a lot of sellers want to just list their homes right at or slightly above or slightly below what the Zestimate is. But in reality, if you want to be more accurate, you should just get an appraisal done on your property before listing it and go with that number instead. That's going to be a much truer reflection of what your home is really worth, and it's also going to make it much easier to sell because when your buyer goes to get their own appraisal, you know the house is going to appraise. So long story short is do not rely on the Zestimates. They are exactly that, a Zestimate. An estimate is literally in the word. So don't take it at face value. It has gotten better over the years, but still, it's just an estimate. But no doubt, Zestimates are guilty and responsible partly for helping to drive up these insane home values. Essentially helping sellers in the neighborhood all believing that their homes are worth more than they actually are. And then if you have a lot of buyers come in that are dumb enough to pay those prices, well, all of a sudden those houses become worth that because people decided to pay it. Now, one of my other viewers sent me an email with a listing in North Carolina that just recently sold for practically half of what the owner paid for it just last July. And you might think, like, how on earth is that possible? How could they have lost so much so quickly? Well, it's because of natural disaster, okay? This house was sold back in July of 2024 for $338,647. Fast forward to today, March 11th, 2025, it sold for $164,900. Apparently this home was damaged by wind and rain, and the owner could not afford to repair it. And the reason why this listing was sent to me is because he said at the end, listen, you're right, people are out of money. If people had the money, they could afford to repair this house. They could afford to take out a loan to get it done, or their insurance claim would be coming through in order to help get it done. But obviously, a combination of all of those things are broken. Maybe their insurance claim was denied. Maybe their payout was much lower than they actually deserved. They obviously didn't have enough savings set aside to be able to make some of the necessary repairs to get the house sold. So a new owner is coming along and saying, yeah, okay, I'll buy it for half of what you did, so that way I have enough money to come in and repair it. And you just see so many stories and examples of things like this happening lately, especially in natural disaster areas. I'm sure you're gonna see a lot of sales like this take place in the fire zones that got burned down in California a couple months ago. You see sales like this happen in Florida a lot, in areas that got hit by the hurricanes, because people just don't have the money to fix these properties, guys. Most people barely had the money to buy these houses to begin with, let alone come in and spend six figures to get it back up and running on their own. Which is why, going back to the beginning of this video, of why this recession is going to particularly hurt the housing market so much, is because so many people are already so over leveraged on the house that they went out and bought, right? They had to put the lowest amount of down payment and bought the most expensive house they could get with the financing that was available. And that combination of a purchase just leads to a disaster when times get tough, like now. And so any small hiccup, which seems to be the layoffs, is the number one thing that is hurting people right now. You're going to see a lot of people list their homes for sale because they can no longer afford to keep it. And if you see stories like this, let us know in the comments. Feel free to email them over to me. I'll be happy to share a few good examples in future videos. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to the channel. And if you don't want to wait for my next video to come out, check out this one on the screen right over here, and I'll see you in the next one.